Tonight, we wade into a story of beauty and death, of desire and deception, of a flower so deadly that its very name whispers of the grave. Before we begin this long journey through centuries of poison and vanity, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Put your phone face down, turn the volume to a whisper, and let's descend into the dark, seductive history of a plant that promised beauty but delivered blindness, that offered healing but threatened death with every drop. The deadly beauty. In a shaded corner of a European forest, where the sunlight filters through ancient canopy and the air hangs thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, there grows a plant of such singular menace that even its name carries the weight of mythology. It stands perhaps 5 feet tall, maybe 6 if the season has been kind. Its stems a dull, greenish purple, slightly hairy to the touch. The leaves are broad and oval, unremarkable in their deep green hue, the kind of foliage you might pass without a second glance on an afternoon walk through the woods. But then you notice the flowers. They are beautiful in a sinister way, bell-shaped blossoms that droop from the stem like tiny lanterns hanging from invisible strings. The petals form a perfect tube, their color a dusky purple, fading to a sickly yellow-green at the base, with delicate veins of darker purple running through them like the tracery of blood vessels beneath pale skin. They have an odd, almost lurid quality to them, as if they know something you don't. And they do, because this plant, in every part of its structure, from the deepest taproot buried in the soil to the tip of each pointed leaf, from the sweet flesh of its shiny black berries to the pollen that dusts its stamens, this plant is death incarnate. The berries are perhaps the most insidious part. They ripen in late summer, swelling into glossy spheres of deep purple-black that look disturbingly like the blueberries or currants a child might pluck and eat without thinking. They even taste sweet, a cruel evolutionary trick that has led to countless poisonings throughout history. Just 2 or 3 of these innocent-looking fruits contain enough of the plant's alkaloid poison to kill a small child. 10 or 15 might be fatal to an adult. They sit there on the plant, tempting and deadly, nature's perfect trap. This is a tropa BELLaDONNa, and it has more names than any plant has a right to possess. In England, they call it deadly nightshade, a name that captures both its nocturnal associations and its lethal nature. In German-speaking lands, it's Tollkirsch, the mad cherry, or Teufelsbeer, devil's berry. The French know it as Belle Dame, or Morel Furious. In Old English texts, you'll find it called dwale, a word that comes from the Scandinavian for trance or sleep, or banewort, meaning quite literally the plant of death. The Italians have perhaps the most poetic name, Erba del Diavolo, the devil's herb. But it is the scientific name, given to it by the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus in 1753, that tells us most about how humanity has understood this plant for millennia. Atropa, from Atropos, the eldest and most inexorable of the 3 fates in Greek mythology. Atropos, whose name means the inflexible one, the unturning one, she who cannot be persuaded. While her sisters Clotho and Lachesis spin and measure the thread of each human life, it is Atropos who wields the shears. It is Atropos who cuts, and when she cuts, there is no appeal, no reprieve, no going back. The thread is severed, and the life is done. Linnaeus looked at this plant, understood its absolute and final power over human life, and named it for the goddess of inevitable death. And BELLaDONNa, beautiful lady, beautiful woman, a name that speaks not of death but of desire, not of poison but of allure. It is a name that hints at the strange duality of this plant, at the fact that for centuries, despite knowing full well that it could kill them, women placed drops made from its juice directly into their eyes. They did this willingly, eagerly even, because those drops would cause their pupils to dilate, to grow wide and dark. And in the courts of Renaissance Italy, in the salons of Venice and Florence, Large dark pupils were considered the height of beauty and sensuality. BELLaDONNa, beautiful lady. The price of beauty has always been high, but rarely has it been quite so literally lethal. The plant itself belongs to the Solanaceae family, the nightshades, a group that includes both the deadly and the delicious in equal measure. Tomatoes are nightshades. So are potatoes, eggplants, and bell peppers. But so too are tobacco, mandrake, henbane, and jimsonweed, each one a cousin to BELLaDONNa, each one containing various combinations of the same class of alkaloid compounds that make our subjects so terribly dangerous. It's a family of extremes, of plants that humans have cultivated both to feed themselves and to destroy their enemies. BELLaDONNa is native to Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia, though like so many things associated with human history, it has traveled. You can find it now in parts of North America, growing wild in disturbed soils along roadsides and in waste places, thriving in the partial shade of deciduous forests. It prefers rich, moist soil with good drainage, limestone soils especially. It is a perennial, dying back to the ground each winter and re-emerging in spring from its extensive root system, growing quickly through the warmer months to flower in June and July, producing its deadly berries by late summer. The root is thick and fleshy, often branching, and can extend several feet into the earth. If you were to dig one up and cut it open, you would find pale flesh that smells faintly of something both earthy and slightly acrid. The smell is not unpleasant, but there is something about it that warns of its nature, something that makes the primitive part of your brain pull back slightly. The leaves can grow quite large, up to 7 or 8 inches in length, and they tend to grow in pairs along the stem, though the pairs are unequal in size, giving the plant a slightly asymmetrical, unsettling appearance. Everything about this plant seems designed to both attract and warn. The flowers are beautiful but strange. The berries are sweet but deadly. The very structure of the plant, with its slightly purple stems and oddly paired leaves, gives it an air of being not quite right, of being something that has stepped slightly sideways from the normal order of nature, which in a sense it has, because the compounds that make BELLaDONNa so dangerous are not incidental to its nature. They are its defense mechanism, its evolutionary strategy for survival. The plant produces these poisons to protect itself from being eaten, from being damaged by herbivores. The fact that humans then discovered ways to use these same poisons for their own purposes, for medicine and murder, for beauty and warfare, for religious ecstasy and criminal madness, that is the strange and terrible history we are about to explore. Ancient origins, the first encounters. Long before there were written records, before there were cities or empires, before humans had figured out how to cultivate grain or domesticate animals, our ancestors knew about plants that could alter consciousness, ease pain, or bring death. This knowledge was not academic. It was survival. In a world where a simple infection could kill you, where chronic pain was an inescapable reality of daily life, where spiritual experiences were as important as physical ones, plants were the only pharmacy available. And among those plants, BELLaDONNa and its nightshade cousins were some of the most powerful. We have evidence that humans were interacting with plants from the Solanaceae family as far back as the Bronze Age. Archaeological digs in Neolithic settlements have turned up seeds from mandrake, a close relative of BELLaDONNa, suggesting that even these early farmers understood the properties of the nightshade family. But BELLaDONNa itself leaves fewer traces in the archaeological record than some other plants. It doesn't preserve as well, and its use may have been more ritualistic and medicinal than dietary, meaning there are fewer physical remains to find. The first clear written references to plants we can identify as BELLaDONNa or its close relatives come from the ancient Greeks. Theophrastus, often called the father of botany, wrote about the medicinal plants of Greece around 300 BC. In his treatise, Inquiry into Plants, he described mandrake, that gnarled root that looks disturbingly like a malformed human body, and recommended it for treating wounds, sleeplessness, and gout. He also noted, rather tellingly, that it could be used as a love potion. This is significant because it suggests that even in this early period, people understood that these plants had profound psychological effects, that they could alter mood and perception, that they could make a person more pliable, more suggestible, more open to influence. By the 1st century AD, the knowledge had become more sophisticated. Pedanius Dioscorides, a Greek physician serving in the Roman army, compiled one of the most comprehensive medical texts of the ancient world, a work called De Materia Medica that would remain a standard reference for over 1,000 years. Dioscorides knew nightshades well. He described mandrake in detail and recommended wine infused with mandrake root as an anesthetic before surgery. This was revolutionary. Imagine being about to undergo a surgical procedure in the 1st century, knowing that there was no way to truly escape the pain, and then being offered a cup of wine that would send you into a deep, dreamless sleep from which you would wake hours later with no memory of the cutting and stitching that had been done to your body. That was the promise of the nightshades. But Dioscorides was also careful. He understood that these plants were dangerous. He noted the proper dosages, warned about the symptoms of poisoning, described what would happen if you took too much. The ancient physicians were walking a tightrope between remedy and poison, and they knew it. The line between healing and killing was measured in a few drops, a few leaves, a slight miscalculation. And sometimes the miscalculation was not an error at all, because if these plants could be used to ease suffering, they could just as easily be used to cause it, or to end it permanently. The ancient world was intimately familiar with poison as a tool of murder and political control. In Rome, the knowledge of poisons was considered a dark art, but a useful one. There were professionals, usually women, who specialized in the preparation of toxic substances, who could be hired discreetly to solve inconvenient problems. And BELLaDONNa, with its wide range of effects depending on dose and its relatively common availability, was a favored weapon in their arsenal. The historical sources, though fragmentary and often written with clear political biases, give us glimpses of this shadow world. The historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, claimed that the Empress Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus Caesar, used belladonna-laced figs to poison her husband, the first Roman emperor. According to Tacitus, Livia painted the poison on figs that were still growing on the tree in the imperial villa's garden, knowing that Augustus had a habit of picking and eating fresh figs during his morning walks. Whether this story is true or simply political propaganda aimed at discrediting Livia is impossible to say with certainty. But the fact that Tacitus could tell such a story and expect his audience to find it plausible tells us that everyone in Rome understood that such things were possible, and that the nightshades were the tools with which such crimes were committed. A century later, another poisoning would become famous, or rather infamous. The Emperor Claudius died in October of the year 54 after eating a dish of mushrooms at a banquet. The suspicion immediately fell on his wife, Agrippina the Younger, who had much to gain from Claudius's death, as it would clear the way for her son Nero to become emperor. The ancient historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all claim that Agrippina enlisted the help of a famous poisoner named Locusta to prepare the fatal meal. According to their accounts, Locusta did not simply poison the mushrooms themselves, but prepared a sauce to accompany them, a sauce infused with belladonna and possibly other toxins. Claudius ate the dish, fell ill, began to recover slightly, and was then finished off with a second dose, this time administered more directly, possibly in a medicinal preparation that was supposed to help him vomit up the original poison, but instead completed the work Agrippina had begun. Locusta herself is a fascinating and frightening figure. She appears in the historical record as a professional poisoner, a woman who had been convicted and imprisoned for her crimes, but was so skilled at her deadly craft that Agrippina arranged for her release so she could put her talents to use. After Claudius's death, Nero kept Locusta on retainer, using her services to eliminate various inconvenient individuals, including his own stepbrother Britannicus. She was eventually executed after Nero's fall from power, but her legend lived on as the archetype of the cold, calculated poisoner who could dispatch a victim with a preparation so subtle that it might never be detected as anything other than natural illness. Whether these stories are entirely true is less important than what they reveal about the role of plants like BELLaDONNa in the ancient world. They were understood to be powerful, dangerous, and useful. They could heal or harm with equal facility. They were the domain of specialists, of physicians and priests and poisoners, people who had the knowledge and the nerve to handle substances that existed at the very edge of what was controllable. The nightshades were also used in religious and mystical contexts. The cult of Dionysus, that most wild and ecstatic of Greek gods, was said to use various intoxicating substances in their rituals, creating states of religious frenzy in which normal social boundaries dissolved and worshippers felt themselves possessed by the god himself. While the primary intoxicant was almost certainly wine, there are suggestions in the ancient sources that other substances were added to the ritual cup, substances that would produce visions and hallucinations, that would open the mind to experiences beyond the ordinary. BELLaDONNa and its cousins would have been perfect for this purpose. Similarly, in the worship of Hecate, the Greek goddess of witchcraft, magic, and crossroads, plants of the nightshade family held a special place. Hecate was a liminal deity, associated with boundaries and transitions, with the space between day and night, life and death, the mundane and the magical. Her worship involved offerings and rituals that took place at night, often at crossroads, those places where three ways meet and decisions must be made. The nightshades, with their ability to transport consciousness, to blur the boundaries between waking and dreaming, between this world and whatever lay beyond, were sacred to her. To consume them in a ritual context was to invite Hecate's presence, to ask for her guidance in navigating the dangerous spaces between states of being. The Romans, ever practical, also used BELLaDONNa in warfare. There are accounts of armies deliberately contaminating their enemies' food supplies with nightshade preparations, knowing that even if the doses weren't fatal, they would cause enough disorientation, hallucination, and physical incapacitation to render an opposing force helpless. Imagine an army waking up to find that their sentries are seeing things that aren't there, that their soldiers cannot coordinate movements, that chaos and panic are spreading through the rank for no reason anyone can identify. It would be a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, undermining morale and creating an atmosphere of supernatural dread. Shakespeare knew this history well. In the play Macbeth, he has the Scottish army defeat an invading Danish force by offering them peace and a feast, then poisoning the wine with BELLaDONNa. The Danes drink, fall into a stupor, and are slaughtered where they lie. Whether this specific historical incident really occurred is debatable, but the tactic was well known enough that Shakespeare could use it without explanation, confident that his audience would understand immediately what was being described. What's remarkable about all these ancient uses is how they establish patterns that will persist throughout the entire history of BELLaDONNa. It is always a double substance, a pharmakon in the Greek sense of the word, which means both remedy and poison, both cure and curse. It is always associated with specialists, with people who have secret knowledge. It is always tied to transgression, to crossing boundaries that should not be crossed, whether those are the boundaries between health and sickness, life and death, or the physical and the spiritual. It is a substance that allows humans to do things that should not be possible, to see things that should not be seen, to exert power that should not be exercised. And there is always a price. The chemical heart, tropane alkaloids. To understand why BELLaDONNa has the effects it does, why it can heal in tiny doses and kill in slightly larger ones, why it causes the particular constellation of symptoms that it does, we need to descend into the molecular level, into the realm of organic chemistry and neuroscience, into the invisible war that these compounds wage inside the human body. This is a story of keys and locks, of messages interrupted and systems thrown into chaos. The power of BELLaDONNa lies in three primary chemical compounds, all of them belonging to a class of molecules called tropane alkaloids. These are atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. They are structurally similar to each other, variations on a theme, and they are produced by the plant in varying concentrations in different parts of its anatomy. The root tends to have the highest concentration, followed by the leaves, then the stems, the flowers, and finally the berries, which, despite being the most obviously tempting part of the plant, actually have relatively lower concentrations of alkaloids compared to other parts. This is small comfort, since even their lower concentration is more than enough to kill. Let's start with atropine, which is actually not a single molecule, but a mixture, a racemic compound composed of equal parts of two mirror image molecules called enantiomers. The naturally occurring form in the plant is L-hyoscyamine, which is the more pharmacologically active form. When the plant material is processed or stored, this L-hyoscyamine tends to convert partially into its mirror image, D-hyoscyamine, and the resulting 50-50 mixture of the two is what we call atropine. For practical purposes, when we talk about the effects of atropine, we're really talking about the effects of hyoscyamine, since that's the form that has the strong biological activity. Then there's scopolamine, also called hyoscine, which has a slightly different structure, with an oxygen bridge across part of the molecule that changes how it behaves in the body. Scopolamine is particularly notable because, unlike hyoscyamine, it can cross the blood-brain barrier very easily, meaning it has pronounced effects on the central nervous system, on consciousness and perception, not just on the peripheral nervous system. All three of these compounds work in essentially the same way, though with varying potencies and slightly different profiles of effects. They are anticholinergic agents, specifically antagonists of muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. To understand what this means, we need to take a brief detour into the neuroscience of the autonomic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that handles all the automatic functions of your body, the things you don't have to consciously think about: breathing, digestion, heart rate, pupil dilation, sweating, salivation, urination. All of these are controlled by the autonomic system. This system has two main divisions that work in opposition to each other, like two hands on a dimmer switch, one pushing in one direction, one pushing in the other, maintaining balance. There's the sympathetic nervous system, which ramps things up, preparing your body for action, for fight or flight. And there's the parasympathetic nervous system, which does the opposite, calming things down, promoting rest and digestion and recovery. The parasympathetic system relies heavily on a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the chemical messenger that nerve cells release to communicate with the organs they control. When a parasympathetic nerve ending releases acetylcholine, it binds to receptors on the target organ, and this binding causes a response. In the heart, it causes the heart rate to slow down. In the digestive tract, it causes the smooth muscles to contract, moving food along. In the eyes, it causes the circular muscles of the iris to contract, making the pupils smaller. In various glands, it triggers secretion, producing saliva, sweat, tears, digestive enzymes. Now, there are different types of acetylcholine receptors, but the ones we care about for BELLaDONNa are called muscarinic receptors, named after another poisonous substance, muscarine from certain mushrooms, which activates them. These muscarinic receptors are like locks, and acetylcholine is the key that fits them and turns them, triggering the cellular response. What atropine and its relatives do is simple and devastating. They fit into those same locks, into those muscarinic receptors, but they don't turn. They just sit there, blocking the lock, preventing the real key, acetylcholine, from being able to bind. They are competitive antagonists, competing with acetylcholine for the receptor binding sites and winning because they have a higher affinity for the receptor, a tighter grip. And as long as they're sitting in those receptors, the parasympathetic nervous system might as well not exist. Its signals cannot get through. The result is that the sympathetic nervous system, which is still working normally, now has no opposition. It's like releasing one side of a tug-of-war rope. Everything lurches in one direction. Your heart rate increases because there's nothing telling it to slow down. Your pupils dilate massively because the muscles that constrict them are paralyzed. Your mouth becomes dry as a bone because salivation shuts off. Your skin flushes and becomes hot because you stop sweating, losing your ability to cool yourself through evaporation. Your digestive system essentially stops, causing constipation and potentially dangerous ileus, a paralysis of the intestines. Your bladder cannot empty properly, leading to urinary retention. You cannot focus your eyes on near objects because the ciliary muscles that change the shape of your lens are paralyzed. And if the dose is high enough, if enough of these molecules cross into your brain, the central nervous system effects kick in. This is where things become truly strange and frightening. Acetylcholine is used throughout the brain as a neurotransmitter, particularly in areas involved in memory, learning, and attention. When you block it, when you flood the brain with anticholinergic agents like scopolamine, cognition begins to break down. Short-term memory becomes fragmented and unreliable. You lose track of where you are, what you were just doing, what was said to you moments ago. The boundary between internal thoughts and external reality begins to dissolve. People experiencing anticholinergic delirium report hallucinations that are remarkably different from those induced by other types of drugs. These are not the geometric patterns and color distortions of psychedelics, not the gentle warping of perception that comes from cannabis. Anticholinergic hallucinations are fully formed, completely realistic, and absolutely convincing. You might see people who aren't there and have complete conversations with them. You might see objects or animals that seem entirely real, only to reach for them and find your hand passing through empty air. The medical literature is full of descriptions of patients who, under the influence of BELLaDONNa alkaloids, would pick at invisible objects in the air, carry on animated conversations with absent friends, or become convinced they were somewhere else entirely, acting out complex scenarios that had no connection to their actual surroundings. There's a reason anticholinergic delirium is sometimes called a true delirium in medical terminology. It's not just altered perception. It's a fundamental breakdown in the brain's ability to construct a coherent model of reality. You lose the thread of your own consciousness. You become untethered. And then there are the more disturbing effects. As the dose increases, the nervous system effects become life-threatening. Seizures can occur. The heart, racing wildly without any parasympathetic break, can develop dangerous arrhythmias. Body temperature, without the cooling effect of sweating, can spike to dangerous levels, potentially causing permanent brain damage. Eventually, if the dose is high enough, respiratory paralysis sets in. The muscles that control breathing, normally regulated by the autonomic system, simply stop working. The person suffocates, drowning in air their body can no longer process. The lethal dose varies considerably from person to person, influenced by age, body weight, metabolism, and previous exposure. Children are particularly vulnerable. It's estimated that as few as 10 to 20 milligrams of pure atropine might be fatal to a child, while an adult might survive 50 milligrams. The berries of the BELLaDONNa plant contain approximately 0.4% tropane alkaloids by weight, which means that a berry weighing about 500 milligrams might contain roughly 2 milligrams of alkaloids. Do the math, and you can see that it doesn't take many berries to reach a fatal dose, especially for a small child who, attracted by the sweet taste, might eat several before anyone realizes what's happening. And here's the truly insidious part. The effects come on slowly. Unlike some poisons that act within minutes, BELLaDONNa poisoning develops over the course of an hour or more. By the time the symptoms become severe enough to cause alarm, a significant amount of the alkaloid has already been absorbed into the bloodstream, and there's little that can be done to remove it quickly. The alkaloids bind tightly to their receptor targets and can persist for days. The effects of a single dose of atropine eye drops, the kind used by ophthalmologists to dilate pupils for an eye exam, can last for 7 to 14 days. Imagine those same compounds at toxic levels, pervading every system in your body, and you begin to understand why BELLaDONNa poisoning was so feared and why it was so useful to those who understood how to employ it. There's an antidote of sorts. Physostigmine, a compound derived from the calabar bean, works by inhibiting the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. If you can't get the antagonist out of the receptors, you flood the system with so much acetylcholine that some of it manages to compete successfully for the remaining unblocked receptors. It's a chemical arms race, and it has to be done carefully because too much physostigmine can cause its own problems, essentially creating a cholinergic crisis in the opposite direction. But in cases of severe anticholinergic poisoning, when someone is seizing or their body temperature is climbing toward fatal levels, physostigmine can be life-saving, pulling them back from the brink by restoring some semblance of normal neurotransmission. The medical community has a mnemonic to remember the signs of anticholinergic toxicity, a dark little rhyme: hot as a hare, blind as a bat, dry as a bone, red as a beet, mad as a hatter. Hot from the fever, blind from the massive pupil dilation and paralysis of focusing, dry from the complete shutdown of secretions, red from the flushed, vasodilated skin, and mad from the delirium and hallucinations. It's a vivid and accurate summary of a poisoning syndrome that, once you've seen it, you never forget. Understanding this chemistry, this mechanism of action, helps us make sense of everything else in BELLaDONNa's history. It explains why physicians could use it as an anesthetic and a muscle relaxant. It explains why it caused a specific constellation of effects that made it useful in certain medical contexts and deadly in others. It explains why the Renaissance women who put drops in their eyes experienced dilated pupils, but also increased risk of glaucoma and permanent vision damage. It explains why the witches who rubbed ointments containing BELLaDONNa on their skin and mucous membranes reported the sensation of flying, of leaving their bodies, of traveling to impossible places. It wasn't magic. It was chemistry. It was the systematic disruption of the neurological processes that construct our sense of self and reality. And humanity, throughout its entire history, has been both fascinated and terrified by that disruption. The goddess of vengeance, mythology, and names. When Carl Linnaeus sat down in the middle of the 18th century to organize and name the entire living world, to create the system of binomial nomenclature that we still use today, he understood that names have power. He understood that the name you give to something shapes how people think about it, how they relate to it, what cultural weight it carries. And when he came to this particular plant, this most famous of deadly nightshades, he reached back through thousands of years of Mediterranean mythology to find the perfect name: Atropa. Atropos, the inflexible, the unturning, the inevitable. In Greek mythology, the Moirai, the three fates, controlled the destiny of every mortal being. They lived at the base of the throne of Zeus himself, and even the king of the gods could not overrule their decisions. These were not gentle fairy godmothers. They were cosmic forces, the personification of necessity and destiny, and they were absolute. Clotho, the spinner, drew out the thread of each life on her spinning wheel. Lachesis, the alator, measured the thread, determining the length of each life and the nature of the fate each person would endure. And Atropos, the eldest and most terrible, cut the thread with her shears. When Atropos cut, there was no reprieve, no negotiation, no second chance. The thread was severed, the life was over, and that was the end of it. Atropos was depicted in ancient art as an older woman, often stern-faced, holding a pair of shears or scissors. Sometimes she was shown with a sundial or a scroll, symbols of time and destiny. Unlike her sisters, who might be shown in the act of spinning or measuring, Atropos was always shown in the moment of the cut, the decisive instant when potential became fixed, when the living became the dead. She was the moment of death itself, personified. There's a reason Linnaeus chose this name. BELLaDONNa is a plant that embodies finality. The margin between a therapeutic dose and a lethal dose is so narrow that a slight miscalculation, a moment's inattention, a child's curiosity, and the result is irrevocable. Once enough of the alkaloid has been absorbed, modern medicine can try to support the patient through the crisis, can use antidotes and interventions to mitigate the effects, but there is no way to simply undo what has been done. The molecular lock and key have engaged, the receptors are blocked, and the cascade of effects will run its course no matter what you do. Like the shears of Atropos, the plant's action is final. But Atropos was not the only deity associated with BELLaDONNa and its nightshade kin. In Roman religion, the goddess BELLaDONNa held a special place. BELLaDONNa was the goddess of war, but not in the heroic, strategic sense of Mars. BELLaDONNa was the frenzy of battle, the blood madness that came over warriors in combat, the moment when human consciousness dissolved into pure violence. She was depicted with a sword and a torch, often wearing a blood-stained dress, her hair wild and unbound. Her temple in Rome was located outside the city's sacred boundary because her energy was too dangerous, too chaotic, to be contained within the city itself. Priests of BELLaDONNa, called Bellarii, would work themselves into states of ecstatic frenzy as part of their worship. Ancient sources describe them cutting their own arms and legs with knives, dancing wildly as the blood flowed, speaking in tongues, and making prophecies while in their altered state. Some historians have suggested that they may have used psychoactive substances to achieve these states, substances that would have included nightshades like BELLaDONNa. The connection between the plant's name, BELLaDONNa, and the goddess BELLaDONNa is probably coincidental, as the plant's Italian name comes from BELLaDONNa, beautiful woman, while BELLaDONNa's name comes from bellum, war. But the association is thematically resonant. Both involve a kind of dangerous ecstasy, a crossing of boundaries, a state in which normal human consciousness is suspended. Perhaps most significant for our story is the association with Hecate, the Greek goddess of magic, witchcraft, crossroads, and the night. Hecate is a liminal deity, one associated with boundaries and transitions. She rules over doorways and crossroads, those places where multiple paths meet and choices must be made. She is the guide of souls between worlds, the guardian of the boundary between life and death. She is associated with the dark of the moon, with the hours between sunset and sunrise, with all the uncertain, dangerous, fertile space between defined states. In ancient art, Hecate is often shown holding two torches, illuminating the darkness, showing the way forward in the uncertain night. She is sometimes depicted with three bodies or three heads, facing in different directions, seeing all paths simultaneously. Her sacred animals are the dog, the polecat, and the snake, creatures associated with death and the underworld. And her sacred plants are the plants of the nightshade family, mandrake, henbane, and BELLaDONNa. Hecate's worship involved nighttime rituals at crossroads, particularly three-way crossroads, those places where three roads meet and form a Y. Offerings will be left at these spots: food, wine, and sometimes psychoactive plants. Those who worshipped Hecate or sought her help in magical workings were said to use ointments and potions containing nightshades to induce visions, to facilitate communication with the dead, to blur the boundary between the mundane world and the realm of spirits and gods. There's a direct line from these ancient practices to the much later medieval and Renaissance traditions of witchcraft, a continuity of knowledge about these plants and their effects that persisted through the collapse of the classical world and into the Christian era. What's fascinating about all these mythological associations is how they cluster around similar themes: death, warfare, frenzy, ecstasy, boundary crossing, altered states of consciousness, secret knowledge, danger, and power. BELLaDONNa is never just a plant. It is always more than that, always laden with meaning, always understood to be a key that can unlock doors that perhaps should remain locked. The act of using BELLaDONNa, whether in medicine or magic, in healing or harming, is always portrayed as transgressive in some way, as requiring special knowledge and special courage, as carrying inherent risk. There's also an interesting gender dimension to these associations. Atropos, BELLaDONNa, and Hecate are all female deities, and as we'll see throughout this history, BELLaDONNa has often been particularly associated with women, both as users and as victims. The beautiful lady who puts drops in her eyes, the witch who brews potions and ointments, the poisoner who dispatches inconvenient husbands, the midwife who uses it to ease childbirth or cause abortion. These are all feminine archetypes, and they all involve the use of specialized knowledge about this plant. Whether this reflects some historical reality about who actually had expertise with BELLaDONNa, or whether it's a projection of patriarchal anxieties about women's power and women's secrets, or some combination of both, is a complex question that we'll return to as we move through the story. But the most important thing the mythological names tell us is this: humanity has always understood that this plant is not ordinary. It stands apart. It has the power to fundamentally alter reality, either by changing consciousness in those who consume it or by ending consciousness entirely. It is a threshold substance, and threshold substances are always sacred, always dangerous, always the domain of specialists who stand between the mundane and the extraordinary. When Linnaeus named it atropa, he was not just making a clever classical reference. He was acknowledging a truth that went back millennia, that this plant, more than almost any other, has the power to cut the thread of life. And once cut, like Atropus's shears, the thread cannot be restored. Witches, flight, and the medieval mind. The connection between witchcraft and BELLaDONNa is so deeply embedded in European cultural consciousness that it's almost impossible to think of one without the other. The image of the witch, the archetypal figure with her cauldron and her broomstick and her forbidden knowledge, is inextricably linked to these poisonous plants of the nightshade family. But the relationship is more complex and more contested than popular culture suggests. To understand it, we need to navigate carefully between historical evidence, later mythology, and the politics of how witchcraft was understood and prosecuted in medieval and early modern Europe. Let's start with what we know about so-called flying ointments, those legendary preparations that witches were said to use to fly through the air to their nocturnal gatherings, the witches' sabbaths. The earliest references to such ointments appear in texts from the 13th and 14th centuries, in theological and legal documents concerned with heresy and devil worship. These are not neutral scientific reports. They are documents written by inquisitors, by men whose job it was to root out and destroy heresy, and who had very specific ideas about what they expected to find. One of the earliest detailed accounts comes from a text called the Formicarius, written around 1452 by a German theologian named Johannes Nieder. In it, Nieder describes witches using ointments that allowed them to fly through the air to gatherings where they worshipped the devil, engaged in sexual orgies, and plotted evil against good Christians. According to Nieder, these ointments were made from the fat of murdered children, mixed with various herbs, and applied to the body. A few years later, in 1456, another German writer named Johannes Hartley produced a treatise called The Book of All Forbidden Arts, which contained what is claimed to be the first detailed recipe for such an ointment. According to Hartley, the flying ointment contained BELLaDONNa, henbane, and mandrake, along with various animal fats and other substances. The ointment was to be rubbed onto the skin, and particularly onto the mucous membranes, areas where absorption would be most rapid and complete. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Modern researchers who have looked at these recipes and understood the pharmacology involved have noted something crucial. The plants listed, BELLaDONNa, henbane, mandrake, and sometimes also hemlock, wolfsbane, and others, are all highly psychoactive. They contain alkaloids that, when absorbed through the skin or mucous membranes, can produce powerful hallucinations, a sense of dissociation from the body, disorientation in time and space, and a sensation of movement or flight. In other words, these recipes, whether they were actually used by anyone or not, describe preparations that would genuinely cause the sensation of flying if applied as directed. But there's a crucial problem with assuming that these recipes represent some continuous underground tradition of pre-Christian shamanic practice, as some popular writers have claimed. The historical evidence for widespread use of such ointments is actually very thin. When we look at the thousands of witch trial records that survive from the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, confessions involving flying ointments are relatively rare. Most accused witches, even under torture, did not confess to using such ointments. When they did describe flying, they more often claimed to have flown on demons or animals, or simply to have been transported by magical means without specifying method. So where did the flying ointment stories come from? Most likely, they're a complex mix of several sources. There may have been some real folk practices involving the topical use of nightshades for pain relief or altered states. Medieval oibles and medical texts certainly describe such uses. There may have been some experimentation by individuals trying to induce visions or mystical experiences. But the elaborate narratives about Sabbaths and devil worship and flying through the air, those seem to be primarily the creation of the witch hunters themselves, of theologians and inquisitors who had read each other's works and who carried these expectations into the torture chambers, using leading questions and physical coercion to extract confessions that match the narrative they expected to hear. Let's talk about what these substances actually do when applied topically. The skin is not as permeable as the mucous membranes of the vagina, anus, or mouth, but it is permeable to some degree, especially if the active compounds are dissolved in a fat or oil base. When tropane alkaloids from BELLaDONNa are absorbed through the skin, they enter the bloodstream more slowly than if they were injected or swallowed, but they still enter, and they still have effects. The sensation would likely begin gradually, perhaps over the course of 30 to 60 minutes. You would start to feel strange, disoriented. Your heart would begin to race. Your mouth would become dry. Your vision would blur, and the room would seem to shift and waver. As the dose built up in your system, as more and more of the receptors in your brain became blocked by the anticholinergic alkaloids, the hallucinations would begin. Remember, these are not psychedelic hallucinations. They don't announce themselves as hallucinations. You don't see geometric patterns or mild distortions that you can recognize as not quite real. What you see under the influence of BELLaDONNa and its relatives appears completely real. You might see people in the room with you, hear them speak, carry on full conversations with them. You might suddenly believe you're somewhere else entirely, acting out scenarios that seem perfectly plausible to you, even though they make no sense to anyone observing from outside. And here's the key detail that explains the flying motif. People under the influence of these substances often report a sense of bodily distortion, a feeling that they are expanding, floating, moving through space in impossible ways. Your body image, your sense of where your limbs are and what they're doing, is heavily dependent on continuous feedback from sensory receptors in your muscles, joints, and skin, feedback that is processed by parts of your brain that use acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. Block that system, and your sense of physical embodiment begins to dissolve. You might feel as if you're growing larger or smaller, as if your body is elongating or compressing, as if you are drifting upward or moving at impossible speeds. If you had cultural expectations about what flying feels like, if flying was part of the narrative you expected, then that's exactly how you would interpret this somatic dissolution. You would believe, with absolute conviction, that you had flown. There's also evidence that sometimes these preparations were intentionally applied to wooden staffs or broom handles, which were then rubbed against the genitals or inserted. This served two purposes. It provided a method of application that would ensure rapid absorption through the highly vascular mucous membranes of the vaginal or anal areas, and it may have had a practical ritual significance. The broom, after all, was and is one of the most common domestic tools, associated with women's domestic work, with sweeping out the old to make room for the new, with cleansing and preparation. A broomstick anointed with magical ointment and used in a ritual context becomes a tool for transformation, for transportation, for crossing boundaries. This is likely the origin of the iconic image of witches riding broomsticks through the night sky. It's not describing literal physical flight. It's describing a method of inducing a visionary experience that was interpreted within a cultural framework where flying to Sabbaths was part of the expected narrative. But we need to be very careful here not to romanticize what was actually happening. These weren't benevolent white witches practicing some ancient religion of nature worship. These were, in most cases, ordinary people, usually poor, usually women, caught up in social tensions, and accused of witchcraft for reasons that had more to do with village politics, property disputes, and scapegoating during times of crisis than with any actual magical practices. The fact that some people may have experimented with psychoactive plants doesn't mean there was any widespread organized cult. And the confessions extracted during trials, even when they include accurate pharmacological details, were almost always extracted under torture or the threat of torture, which makes them fundamentally unreliable as historical evidence. What we can say with more confidence is that by the late medieval period, certain plants, including BELLaDONNa, had acquired a powerful cultural association with the forbidden, the transgressive, and the supernatural. They were liminal substances, existing at the boundary between medicine and poison, healing and harm, the natural and the supernatural. People who worked with these substances, herbalists, midwives, healers, possessed knowledge that was both valuable and suspect. They could ease pain and facilitate childbirth and treat disease, but they could also cause harm, induce abortions, and manipulate consciousness in ways that were both fascinating and terrifying. As the witch-hunting craze intensified in the 15th and 16th centuries, as the Catholic Church and later Protestant reformers sought to consolidate their religious authority and eliminate competing sources of spiritual power, anyone with specialized knowledge of herbs and healing came under suspicion. The wise woman in the village, the one who knew which plants would bring down a fever or ease menstrual cramps, the one who could help a woman avoid an unwanted pregnancy or appear to predict the future, became a target. The same knowledge that had once made her valuable to the community now made her dangerous to ecclesiastical authority. The image of the witch brewing her potions from deadly nightshades, flying through the air to demonic gatherings, served a useful purpose for those in power. It took practical knowledge about plants, knowledge that gave women particularly a degree of autonomy and power, and reframed it as demonic, as evil, as something that needed to be stamped out. By associating BELLaDONNa and its relatives specifically with witchcraft, with devil worship, with sexual transgression and the destruction of children, the authorities made it much harder for people to access this knowledge or use these plants without facing suspicion and potentially deadly consequences. The result was a kind of cultural forgetting, a deliberate suppression of knowledge. The nuanced understanding of how to use these plants safely and effectively, the careful attention to dose and preparation that had characterized much folk medicine, was lost or driven underground. What remained was fear, superstition, and the association with evil. It would not be until the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries that physicians would begin to systematically study these plants again, attempting to separate the genuine therapeutic effects from the mythology and hysteria that had accrued around them. But the cultural mark had been made. In the European imagination, BELLaDONNa and the witch are forever linked, and that association colors everything that comes after. Even today, when we think of witchcraft, we think of cauldrons and broomsticks and mysterious herbs. And at the center of that imagery, whether we know it explicitly or not, is this plant with its purple flowers and its black berries, this beautiful and deadly nightshade, this threshold between healing and harm. The beautiful lady, Renaissance vanity. The Renaissance was an age of dramatic contradictions, and nowhere were those contradictions more visible than in the pursuit of beauty. It was an era that celebrated the individual, that sought to revive classical ideals of proportion and grace, that produced some of the most sublime art in human history. It was also an era of plague, war, political intrigue, and a social order so rigid that a person's appearance could literally mean the difference between success and ruin. In this context, beauty was not merely aesthetic. It was currency. It was power. It was survival. And people were willing to pay extraordinary prices to achieve it. It is in Renaissance Italy, particularly in Venice, that we find the most famous use of BELLaDONNa as a cosmetic, the use that gave the plant its scientific species name. To understand why Venetian women in the 15th and 16th centuries were putting drops of deadly poison directly into their eyes, we need to understand something about the beauty ideals of the time and the social world in which those ideals operated. The ideal Renaissance beauty, as depicted in paintings and described in poetry, had several distinct characteristics. Her skin was to be pale, luminous, almost translucent, suggesting that she did not have to work outdoors in the sun, that she was of high enough status to spend her days indoors. Her hair was ideally golden or light brown, often described in poetic terms as the color of wheat or honey. Her eyes were large and bright and, crucially, seemed to radiate emotion and receptivity. It was this last quality, the eyes as windows to the soul, that made the size and appearance of the pupils so important. In normal lighting, the human pupil is a small black circle in the center of the iris, adjusting its size to regulate the amount of light entering the eye. But the pupil doesn't just respond to light. It also responds to emotional state, to arousal, to interest. When you look at something you find attractive or engaging, your pupils dilate slightly, becoming larger. This is an involuntary response, one of the many unconscious signals that humans use to assess each other's emotional states. And it turns out that people find larger pupils more attractive. When we look at faces with dilated pupils, we unconsciously register them as more engaged, more interested, more emotionally available. There's even some evidence that we interpret dilated pupils as a sign of arousal or attraction, creating a subtle feedback loop where the appearance of attraction triggers actual attraction. Renaissance Italians understood this intuitively, even if they couldn't articulate the neuroscience behind it. They knew that large, dark pupils made a woman's gaze more captivating, more seductive, more powerful. And they discovered that there was a way to achieve this effect artificially, BELLaDONNa. The preparation was relatively simple. Juice pressed from the berries of the BELLaDONNa plant, or an infusion made by steeping the leaves in water or wine, could be placed in small vials. Using a dropper or even just tilting the head back and letting a drop fall into each eye, a woman could apply the liquid directly onto the surface of the eye. The effect was not immediate, but within 10 to 20 minutes, the pupils would begin to dilate. Within 30 to 40 minutes, they would be fully dilated, huge and black, giving the eyes a mesmerizing, otherworldly quality. This practice was most associated with Venice, that floating city of canals and palaces, a place that was simultaneously one of the great commercial hubs of Europe and a center of luxury, art, and sensuality. Venice was known for its courtesans, highly educated and sophisticated women who occupied an ambiguous but powerful position in society. They were not simply prostitutes in the modern sense. They were entertainers, companions, intellectuals, patrons of the arts. They hosted salons, wrote poetry, played musical instruments, engaged in political and philosophical discussions. They moved in elite circles and could wield considerable influence. And their success depended entirely on their ability to attract and maintain the favor of wealthy and powerful patrons, which meant that their appearance was not just important, but absolutely crucial. The courtesans of Venice were famous throughout Europe for their beauty and their sophisticated presentation of self. They spent enormous amounts of money on clothing, jewelry, cosmetics, and perfumes. And they used BELLaDONNa. The dilated pupils gave them an intense, focused gaze that made their patrons feel uniquely seen and desired. It was a form of emotional manipulation, a way of creating the appearance of interest and attraction, even when actual emotions might have been quite different. But courtesans weren't the only ones using BELLaDONNa. The practice spread throughout the upper classes, to the wives and daughters of nobles and merchants. Women who would never have been seen in the company of courtesans nevertheless adopted their beauty techniques. This was Venice in the Renaissance, a society sophisticated enough to separate technique from the person employing it, to recognize that a tool could be morally neutral, even if it was associated with morally suspect individuals. We have visual evidence of this practice, though it's necessarily subtle and subject to interpretation. Titian's painting Woman with a Mirror, which now hangs in the Louvre, shows a young Venetian woman gazing at her reflection. Her pupils, even accounting for artistic license and the difficulties of rendering such fine detail, appear notably large, dark, and dilated. Some art historians have argued that this is a deliberate reference to the use of belladonna, a signal to those who would have understood the reference that this woman is presenting herself in the fashionable manner of the time, that she is employing every tool at her disposal to appear beautiful and desirable. But the pursuit of this beauty came at a terrible cost. The effects of belladonna drops extend far beyond simple pupil dilation. Remember, these are anticholinergic compounds. They don't just affect the iris. They affect the entire eye. The muscles that control the shape of the lens, that allow you to focus on objects at different distances, are paralyzed. This means that women using belladonna drops would have been unable to focus on anything close to them. Reading would have been impossible. Needlework, which was both a practical skill and a socially expected accomplishment for Renaissance women, would have been impossible. Even navigating the rooms of their own homes would have been difficult, with near objects blurry and indistinct while distant objects remained relatively clear. The pupils, stuck in their maximally dilated state, would have made the eyes exquisitely sensitive to light. Bright sunlight would have been painful. Even normal indoor lighting would have been uncomfortable. Women using belladonna regularly would have had to spend their time in dim interiors, avoiding bright spaces, essentially making themselves semi-nocturnal in their habits. And these were just the immediate, temporary effects. Prolonged use led to more serious and potentially permanent problems. Chronic exposure to belladonna can cause changes to the iris structure, making it less flexible and less able to respond even after the drug has cleared the system. It can lead to increased intraocular pressure, the buildup of fluid inside the eye that damages the optic nerve, a condition we now call glaucoma. Glaucoma causes gradual loss of peripheral vision, tunneling the visual field down to a small central spot. If untreated, it leads to complete and permanent blindness. And the treatment for glaucoma, before modern medicine, was exactly nothing. Once the damage was done, it was irreversible. There are accounts from the period of women going blind from the cosmetic use of belladonna. It was known, discussed, and yet the practice continued. The social pressure to conform to beauty standards, to make oneself as attractive as possible in a world where a woman's economic and social survival often depended on her ability to make an advantageous marriage or attract a wealthy patron, was strong enough that women were willing to risk their sight. This is one of the darkest aspects of beauty culture throughout history, the way it convinces women that their value lies primarily in their appearance, and that it is rational to damage or endanger their health in pursuit of looking the way they are told they should look. The irony is palpable. Belladonna, beautiful lady. The plant was named for its use in making women beautiful, but the beauty it created was artificial, temporary, and achieved at the cost of genuine health and function. The woman with the captivating, dilated pupils could not see clearly. The woman whose gaze held such intensity and focus could not focus on anything near her. The beauty was an illusion, a mask that hid damage beneath. This practice was not limited to Italy, though Italy was its most famous center. Similar cosmetic uses of belladonna appeared in France and other parts of Europe where Italian fashion was influential. There are references in French texts to women using aqua tofana, supposedly a Venetian or Neapolitan preparation that may have contained belladonna, among other ingredients, though it was also rumored to be used as a poison. The lines between cosmetic, medicine, and poison were often blurred, and belladonna existed at the intersection of all three. By the 18th century, the practice seems to have declined in frequency, possibly because of increasing awareness of the dangers, possibly because fashion changed and new beauty ideals emerged. But it never entirely disappeared. Throughout the Victorian era, women continued to use diluted preparations of belladonna and related plants for various cosmetic purposes, and the association between belladonna and female beauty, between the deadly plant and the dangerous pursuit of an idealized appearance, remained firmly embedded in European culture. What the Renaissance beauty practices with belladonna teach us is that the pursuit of socially constructed ideals of beauty can drive people to extraordinary and harmful lengths. It demonstrates how cultural pressures can override individual rationality, how the fear of social exclusion or failure can make even the risk of blindness seem acceptable. It shows us that vanity, in the older sense of the word meaning not just narcissism, but the pursuit of empty, superficial things at the cost of genuine value, can be not just foolish but literally destructive. The beautiful lady with her BELLaDONNa pupils was playing a dangerous game, gambling her sight for a momentary enhancement of her social value. And the house always, eventually, wins such bets. The poison path, assassinations, and political murder. If there is one use of BELLaDONNa that has captured the imagination of storytellers, historians, and the general public throughout the ages, it is its use as a poison. This is not a frivolous fascination. Poison has a unique place in the history of political power, offering a method of murder that is subtle, deniable, and accessible to those who might lack the physical strength or military power to kill in more direct ways. And among the many poisons available throughout history, BELLaDONNa and its alkaloids have been particularly significant, combining ready availability, difficulty of detection, and a wide range of effects that could be tailored to circumstances. Poison has always been considered a weapon of the weak, the secretive, and the feminine in patriarchal cultures. This is not because women are naturally more inclined to murder by poison, but because poisoning required no physical strength and could be accomplished through access to food and drink, areas of domestic life where women often have the most knowledge and control. If you were a woman in a position of power but hemmed in by formal and informal restrictions on your ability to act openly, if you were surrounded by bodyguards and soldiers loyal to someone else, if you needed to remove an obstacle but couldn't simply order an execution, poison was one of the few tools available to you. And societies have never forgotten this, leading to a deep cultural association between poison, particularly plant-based poisons, and women. We've already discussed the alleged poisoning of Emperor Augustus by his wife Livia, and the confirmed poisoning of Emperor Claudius by his wife Agrippina, both supposedly involving BELLaDONNa. But these were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a culture of poisoning that existed at the very highest levels of Roman society. The Empress Livia was suspected by her contemporaries of having poisoned not just Augustus, but several other members of the imperial family, whose deaths conveniently cleared obstacles to her son Tiberius's path to power. Whether these suspicions were justified or simply represented posthumous character assassination by her enemies is impossible to determine with certainty. But the fact that such accusations could be made and believed tells us something important about how Romans understood power, gender, and poison. Agrippina's poisoner, Locusta, deserves more attention as a historical figure, though the details we have about her are sparse and come from sources with their own political agendas. She appears in the works of Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio as a professional poisoner, a woman who had been convicted and imprisoned for her crimes, but whose skills were so valuable that she was released to serve the imperial family. The story, perhaps apocryphal but revealing nonetheless, is that Agrippina first hired Locusta to prepare the poisoned mushroom dish that killed Claudius. When the emperor, after eating the dish and becoming violently ill, began to show signs of recovering, Locusta was called back to finish the job. She prepared a second, faster-acting poison, supposedly administered by Claudius's physician in the form of feather dipped in poison and used to tickle the back of the emperor's throat, supposedly to help him vomit, but actually to deliver the final deadly dose directly to the mucous membranes where it would be rapidly absorbed. After Claudius's death and Nero's accession to the throne, Locusta remained in imperial employ. Nero, paranoid and cruel, found her services useful. When he decided to eliminate his stepbrother Britannicus, who represented a potential rival claim to the throne, he called on Locusta. She prepared a poison, tested it on an animal, found it took too long to work, and at Nero's insistence prepared a stronger, faster-acting version. This second preparation was placed in Britannicus's wine at a dinner party, with Nero watching. Britannicus drank, immediately suffered convulsions, and died in front of the assembled guests. Nero, according to the sources, dismissed the incident as an epileptic fit and continued with the meal. Locusta was eventually executed after Nero's fall, but her legend persisted. She became the archetype of the poisoner, the woman with secret knowledge who could dispatch anyone for the right price or under the right coercion. Whether she was a criminal genius or simply a scapegoat, a convenient figure on whom to project all the anxieties about domestic poisoning, is difficult to determine. But her story, and the stories of other poisoners like her, established a template that would persist throughout European history. The medieval and Renaissance periods saw poison continue to be a tool of political and domestic murder, and belladonna remained one of the substances of choice. Part of its appeal was its very ubiquity. Deadly nightshade grew wild in many parts of Europe. It could be found in hedgerows, in forests, in disturbed soil. Someone with the knowledge of what to look for could gather their own supply without having to purchase anything from an apothecary, where the transaction might be remembered. The plant could be dried and stored, or the active alkaloids could be extracted into preparations that would keep for extended periods. Moreover, the symptoms of belladonna poisoning could be confused with various natural illnesses, making it difficult to prove murder. A victim might die after a period of fever, confusion, and general malaise, symptoms that could equally well be attributed to any number of common diseases. In an era before toxicology, before laboratory analysis, before medical examiners, proving that someone had been poisoned was extremely difficult unless the poison acted very quickly and distinctively. Belladonna, given in the right dose, could produce a death that looked natural enough to avoid suspicion, or at least to allow plausible deniability. In the 16th century, Italy gained a reputation as the poison capital of Europe, and Italian poisoners were both feared and in demand. The most famous of these was Giulia Tofana, a woman who sold her services in Naples and Rome in the early to mid-17th century. Tofana's signature product was something called aqua tofana, or manna di San Nicola, a clear, tasteless liquid that she claimed was a cosmetic preparation, but which was in fact a poison. The exact recipe for aqua tofana is not known with certainty, but it was probably a solution containing arsenic as its primary ingredient, possibly combined with lead and antimony. However, some versions of the legend claim that it also contained belladonna or other plant extracts. What's interesting about Tofana is her customer base. She didn't sell to political intriguers or assassins. She sold primarily to women who wanted to rid themselves of their husbands. In an era when marriage was often arranged, when divorce was nearly impossible, when a woman had almost no legal rights and could be subject to violence and abuse with little recourse, poisoning was one of the few ways a woman could escape an intolerable situation. Tofana is said to have sold her poison to over 600 women over a period of about 50 years, mostly in the form of vials disguised as religious items or cosmetics. The poison was reportedly slow-acting, allowing the victim to be dosed gradually over time so that the eventual death would appear natural. Whether the numbers attributed to Tofana are accurate is questionable, as her legend has likely been embellished over time. But she was eventually caught, arrested, and executed, and her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing women access to poisons. The narrative served to reinforce the idea that women with knowledge of toxic substances were inherently dangerous, that this knowledge needed to be controlled and suppressed, that the domestic sphere where women operated was a space of potential threat that needed to be monitored by male authorities. It's important to note here that the historical reality of poisoning was almost certainly less dramatic and less common than the cultural anxiety about poisoning would suggest. Most murders, even in the medieval and Renaissance periods, were committed by more direct means. The number of actual poisoning cases that can be verified from historical records is relatively small, but the fear of poison, the suspicion that any unexpected illness or death might be the result of poisoning, was pervasive. This fear was amplified by the difficulty of proving or disproving poisoning, by the fact that the knowledge required to use poisons effectively was specialized and secretive, and by the gendered associations that made poison seem like a particularly insidious and unnatural form of murder. The other reason poison loomed so large in the cultural imagination was its metaphorical power. Poison is betrayal. It is death that comes from trusted sources, from the food you eat, the wine you drink, the medicine given to you by your physician. It represents the corruption of the domestic, the violation of hospitality, the weaponization of nurture. When you poison someone, you're not just killing them. You're perverting the most basic bonds of trust and care. This made poison particularly associated with treachery and with the violation of natural order, which in turn made it a perfect element in political propaganda. Accusing your enemies of being poisoners was a way of painting them as not just dangerous, but morally depraved, as violating the fundamental norms that held society together. BELLaDONNa fit perfectly into this dark world of poison, intrigue, and fear. Its ubiquity made it accessible. Its effects made it versatile. Its association with witchcraft and forbidden knowledge made it seem particularly sinister. And unlike some poisons, which required extensive preparation or which had distinctive tastes or smells that might allure a victim, BELLaDONNa could be prepared in relatively tasteless forms and administered in small doses mixed into food or drink without easy detection. You could kill with it. You could incapacitate with it. You could drive someone temporarily or permanently insane with it. It was a tool of considerable power, and throughout European history, those who understood how to use it held a particular kind of influence, the influence that comes from being able to remove obstacles quietly and without direct confrontation. The age of the political poisoner began to wane in the 18th and 19th centuries, not because people became more moral, but because states developed more effective policing, because forensic toxicology emerged as a science, making poisoning easier to detect, and because social structures changed in ways that gave people, especially women, more legal recourse in situations of domestic abuse or arranged marriages. But the cultural memory of the poisoner, and of BELLaDONNa as the poisoner's tool, has never entirely faded. It remains part of our folklore, our literature, our understanding of how power operates in the shadows. Medieval medicine, between cure and kill. While poison and witchcraft and Renaissance vanity are the dramatic stories that capture attention, the most widespread and sustained use of BELLaDONNa throughout most of European history was actually as a medicine. This is the less sensational, but arguably more important part of the plant story. The part where physicians and healers attempted to harness its power for genuine therapeutic benefit, while constantly navigating the narrow margin between help and harm. Medieval medicine operated under a different paradigm than modern medicine. It was based on the humoral theory inherited from Greek and Roman physicians, particularly Galen, which held that the body was governed by 4 humors or vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was understood as a balance of these humors, and illness was the result of imbalance. Treatment involved attempting to restore balance, often through dramatic interventions, bloodletting, purging, inducing vomiting, applying blistering agents to the skin. By modern standards, much of medieval medicine was not just ineffective but actively harmful. But within the limited understanding and tools available, physicians were trying to systematically address suffering and disease. BELLaDONNa fit into this system in several ways. Its ability to suppress secretions meant it could be used to treat conditions characterized by excessive moisture or phlegm in the humoral system. The ancient and medieval understanding of inflammation and pain, while not accurate by modern standards, recognized that certain plant substances could provide relief, and BELLaDONNa was one of the most effective available. But its most important medieval medical use was as an anesthetic or pain reliever, particularly in the context of surgery. Surgery in the medieval period was a desperate last resort, undertaken only when the alternative was certain death. There was no understanding of germ theory, no concept of sterile technique, no antibiotics. The mortality rate from surgical infections was staggering. But sometimes surgery was unavoidable. A limb mangled in an accident, an abdominal wound from a weapon, a growth or abscess that needed to be drained. And when surgery had to be performed, the question of pain management was crucial. The patient had to be kept as still as possible, while conscious control of movement remained unreliable. One approach was simply speed. Get in, do what needs to be done, get out as quickly as possible, while strong men held the screaming patient down. This was traumatic for everyone involved and increased the risk of complications from patient movement during the procedure. The alternative was to use some substance that would produce sleep, or at least profound sedation and pain relief. And for this purpose, there were a few options available, the most important of which were opium, mandrake, henbane, and BELLaDONNa. These substances were often used in combination, mixed together to produce what was called a soporific sponge, or sleeping sponge. The technique was described in various medieval surgical texts. You would take a sponge and soak it in a mixture containing extracts of these plants, along with wine or vinegar as a solvent. The sponge would then be dried and stored. When you needed to anesthetize a patient, you would re-moisten the sponge and hold it to the patient's nose and mouth, allowing them to inhale the vapors. Within minutes, the patient would lose consciousness or drift into a state of profound sedation. The surgeon could then perform the procedure. Afterward, some physicians recommended using a sponge soaked in vinegar alone to help revive the patient, though whether this was actually effective or merely ritual is unclear. The problem with this technique, and with any use of BELLaDONNa for anesthesia, was the extreme difficulty of dosing. The concentration of active alkaloids in any given batch of plant material could vary enormously depending on where the plant was grown, what time of year it was harvested, how it was dried and stored, and how the extraction was performed. There were no standardized units, no way to measure exact doses. The physician had to rely on experience, observation, and luck. Give too little, and the patient would not be adequately anesthetized, would be conscious and in pain during the surgery, would move and potentially ruin the procedure. Give too much, and the patient would die, either from respiratory depression during the surgery or from the combination of surgical trauma and drug toxicity afterward. We have to assume that there were many cases where the anesthesia went wrong, where patients died not from the surgery itself, but from the drugs used to make the surgery bearable. But for a patient facing amputation or some other drastic procedure, the choice was between almost certain death from the condition itself and a chance of survival if the surgery succeeded. In that context, the risk of anesthetic death might have seemed acceptable, or at least preferable to the alternative. BELLaDONNa and its relatives were also used for pain relief in non-surgical contexts. Chronic pain conditions, which remain difficult to treat even with modern medicine, were a serious problem in medieval life. Arthritis, gout, neuralgia, chronic back pain, all of these were common and debilitating. Opium was the most effective pain reliever available, but it was expensive and not always accessible, especially in Northern Europe far from the Mediterranean trade routes. BELLaDONNa was a local alternative, less potent as a pure analgesic, but still effective at reducing certain types of pain, particularly pain involving muscle spasm or smooth muscle cramping. There are references in medieval herbals to preparations of BELLaDONNa being used for stomach aches, menstrual cramps, bladder spasms, and similar conditions. The anticholinergic effects, which paralyze smooth muscle, would have genuinely provided relief in these cases. But again, the dosing was always a problem. The difference between a dose that provided therapeutic benefit and a dose that caused dangerous side effects was small enough that poisonings for medicinal use were not uncommon. One particularly interesting medical use of BELLaDONNa in the medieval period was in obstetrics. Childbirth was dangerous, painful, and often prolonged. Midwives, who were the primary attendants at births, had various techniques for trying to ease labor and delivery, and some of these involved the use of BELLaDONNa. The relaxant effect on smooth muscle could potentially help ease the muscular spasms that made labor more difficult and painful. There are accounts of preparations containing BELLaDONNa being given to women in labor, or of ointments containing the plant being applied to the cervix to help it dilate. Whether these interventions were actually effective is difficult to assess from historical sources. The physiology of childbirth is complex, and many factors influence the progress and outcome of labor. What we can say is that midwives believed these preparations helped, and women continued to use them over many generations, which suggests they provided at least some benefit, or at least no obvious immediate harm. But we also have to acknowledge that use of BELLaDONNa in childbirth carried real risks. An overdose could affect the fetus, could depress the mother's respiration at a time when she needed all her strength, could produce confusion and hallucination at a moment when clarity and cooperation were crucial. Another obstetric use of BELLaDONNa, darker and more controversial, was as an abortifacient. The plant's ability to affect smooth muscle meant that it could potentially induce contractions of the uterus, potentially terminating an unwanted pregnancy. This use was necessarily secret and illegal throughout most of European history, punishable by death in many times and places. The knowledge of which plants and in what combinations and doses could cause abortion was part of the secret lore of midwives and wise women, and it was one of the reasons these women were viewed with suspicion by authorities. They had the power to undo a pregnancy, which meant they had power over fertility and family lineage, areas where the established powers, both church and state, wanted absolute control. Using BELLaDONNa as an abortifacient was extraordinarily dangerous. The dose required to reliably induce abortion was very close to the dose that would cause serious toxicity or death in the mother. Many women must have died from such attempts, though these deaths would have been attributed to other causes or simply gone unrecorded, as women who died from illegal abortion attempts would have been blamed and their deaths not investigated with any sympathy. One of the most important developments in the medical use of BELLaDONNa came with its incorporation into early pharmaceutical preparations and the beginning of a more systematic understanding of its effects. By the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, as universities developed and medical education became more formal, physicians began to keep more careful records, to compare notes across regions, to attempt to standardize their practices. The great medical schools at Salerno, Montpellier, Bologna, and Padua became centers where knowledge was accumulated and transmitted. The physicians at these institutions had access to the newly translated works of Arab medical scholars, which meant they had access to the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Islamic Golden Age medicine. They began to produce more systematic compendia of medicinal plants, to describe dosages with more precision, to distinguish more carefully between different preparations and different uses. BELLaDONNa appears in many of these texts, usually with careful warnings about its toxicity and detailed instructions about preparation and dosing. But even as medical knowledge became more sophisticated, even as physicians tried to make the use of BELLaDONNa and similar drugs more scientific, they were still working blind in many ways. They didn't understand the mechanisms. They didn't know about alkaloids or receptors or neurotransmitters. They knew only that this plant, if prepared in certain ways and given in certain amounts, could produce predictable effects. It was empirical knowledge, knowledge built up through centuries of trial and error, through careful observation, and yes, through many deaths. By the end of the medieval period, as we move into the Renaissance and early modern era, BELLaDONNa was firmly established in the European medical pharmacopoeia. It was recognized as both valuable and dangerous, as requiring expert knowledge and careful handling, as existing at the boundary between remedy and poison. The physicians who used it were walking a tightrope, and they knew it. But until the scientific and industrial revolutions produced new drugs and new ways of understanding human physiology, it remained one of the most powerful tools available for managing pain, inducing sleep, and treating a range of conditions for which there were few alternatives. The scientific revolution, understanding the chemistry. For thousands of years, humans had known that BELLaDONNa was powerfully active in the body, but they didn't know why. They could observe the effects, learn to predict them, attempt to standardize dosages. But the fundamental question of what was actually happening, what specific substance was responsible for the plant's effects and how that substance interacted with the human body, remained unanswered. That began to change in the early 19th century with the emergence of modern chemistry and the systematic study of plant alkaloids. The isolation of active compounds from medicinal plants was one of the great scientific achievements of the 19th century, comparable in its importance to the later discovery of antibiotics in the 20th. For the first time, physicians and chemists could move beyond using crude plant materials with their variable potencies to working with pure chemical compounds that could be measured, standardized, and studied systematically. This revolution in pharmacology began with opium and the isolation of morphine in 1803 by the German pharmacist Friedrich Turner, and it quickly spread to other important medicinal plants. BELLaDONNa was an obvious target for this kind of analysis. Everyone knew it was important, everyone knew it was dangerous, and there was considerable interest in understanding what specific substance was responsible for its effects. The first serious attempts came in the 1820s and 1830s, during what we might call the golden age of alkaloid chemistry. In 1831, a German chemist named Friedlieb Ferdinand Runge, who had already made important contributions to understanding coal tar derivatives and had discovered caffeine as a pure compound, turned his attention to BELLaDONNa. Runge was a skilled chemist who understood how to use organic solvents to extract specific compounds from plant materials. He worked with dried BELLaDONNa leaves, using alcohol and acid-base extractions to separate the active principles. While Runge made significant progress in characterizing the chemical properties of the compounds of BELLaDONNa, it was another German pharmacist, Heinrich Friedrich Gustav Mein, who succeeded in 1831 in isolating a pure crystalline form of the primary active compound. He named it atropine, after Atropos, maintaining the mythological connection that Linnaeus had established in naming the plant itself. The isolation of atropine was a watershed moment. For the first time, physicians could work with a standardized preparation, could know exactly how much of the active compound they were giving to a patient. The hope was that this would make the therapeutic use of BELLaDONNa safer and more predictable, and to some extent it did. But it also introduced new dangers. Pure atropine is far more potent by weight than crude plant material. A tiny amount, a few milligrams, is enough to produce strong effects. This meant that the margin for error, while more precisely defined, was also easier to cross through simple mistakes in measurement or preparation. The decades following atropine's isolation saw extensive research into its properties and effects. Physicians began using it systematically for various purposes, documenting carefully the doses required to produce different effects, the timeline of onset and duration, the side effects and contraindications. This clinical research, combined with the emerging field of physiology, which was beginning to understand how nerves and muscles functioned at a biological level, slowly built up a picture of what atropine was actually doing in the body. One of the key breakthroughs came from studies of atropine's effect on the heart. Physicians observed that atropine increased heart rate, and physiologists worked to understand why. Through careful experiments involving electrical stimulation of nerves and measurement of heart responses, they discovered that the heart was under dual control by two different nerves, one that sped it up and one that slowed it down. They found that atropine specifically blocked the slowing effect, allowing the speeding effect to dominate. This was the first hint of what we now understand as the anticholinergic mechanism, though it would be many more decades before the role of acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter was fully worked out. The study of atropine's effect on the pupil was similarly important. Ophthalmologists quickly recognized that atropine could be useful as a diagnostic and therapeutic tool for eye examinations and certain eye conditions. When you wanted to examine the interior of a patient's eye, the retina and optic nerve, you needed the pupil to be dilated so you could see through it. Natural dilation occurred in dim light, but it wasn't always sufficient, and the pupil would constrict again if you used a bright light to actually look inside. Atropine provided a solution. A drop of atropine solution applied to the eye would cause profound, long-lasting pupil dilation that would persist even in bright light, allowing thorough examination. This became and remains a standard practice in ophthalmology. But atropine also revealed something fundamental about eye physiology. By carefully studying which muscles were affected and how they responded to different drugs, physiologists began to map out the nervous control of eye function, distinguishing between the involuntary muscles controlled by the autonomic system and the voluntary muscles controlled by conscious movement. This kind of careful experimental work, using drugs as tools to probe biological systems, was characteristic of 19th century physiology and laid the groundwork for the modern understanding of neuroscience. In 1867, the German chemist Richard Willstatter, who would later win the Nobel Prize for his work on plant pigments, successfully synthesized atropine in a laboratory. This was a significant achievement, not just as a feat of organic chemistry, but as proof that these complex plant compounds could be produced artificially. It opened the possibility that someday pharmaceutical companies might be able to produce atropine on an industrial scale without needing to rely on cultivating BELLaDONNa plants. That possibility became reality in the 20th century, though even today, some pharmaceutical atropine is still extracted from plant sources because it remains economically competitive with synthesis for certain applications. The late 19th and early 20th centuries also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated analytical chemistry techniques. Scientists could now not just isolate pure compounds, but determine their exact molecular structure, understand their three-dimensional shape, modify them chemically to create synthetic variations. This led to the creation of atropine derivatives, drugs that retain some of atropine's useful properties while minimizing certain side effects. These synthetic anticholinergics are still used widely in medicine today for various purposes, from treating motion sickness to managing certain gastrointestinal disorders to serving as pre-medication before surgery. The scientific understanding of BELLaDONNa also revealed something that earlier users had understood only intuitively, that the plant didn't contain just one active compound, but several related alkaloids. In addition to atropine, or more accurately L-hycimine, which partially converts to atropine during processing, BELLaDONNa contains scopolamine, which has stronger effects on the central nervous system and is more sedating, and various minor alkaloids with different balances of properties. Different preparations from different parts of the plant would have different ratios of these compounds, which helped explain why historical accounts described somewhat different effects from different BELLaDONNa preparations. The understanding of these chemicals and how they work transformed medicine, but also created new problems. As atropine became widely available in pure form, cases of poisoning, both accidental and intentional, increased. A bottle of atropine solution looked like a bottle of many other medications. Mistakes in labeling, in transcribing prescriptions, in measuring doses, all of these could lead to serious poisoning or death. The medical literature of the late 19th and early 20th centuries is full of case reports describing atropine poisonings and their outcomes, contributing to a growing body of knowledge about how to recognize and treat these cases. The standardization of atropine also meant that, for the first time in history, poison murders using BELLaDONNa alkaloids could potentially be detected and proven through chemical analysis. Forensic toxicology emerged as a discipline, with chemists developing tests that could detect atropine in tissues, body fluids, and food samples. This made murder by BELLaDONNa more risky and less attractive, though it certainly didn't eliminate it entirely. The most sophisticated poisoners shifted to substances that were harder to detect or that were so new they weren't yet on forensic chemists' radar. By the early 20th century, atropine had been thoroughly characterized chemically, physiologically, and medically. It was understood to be a competitive muscarinic receptor antagonist. Its effects on every major organ system had been documented, its pharmacokinetics had been studied, and guidelines for its safe therapeutic use had been established. The plant that had been used for millennia based purely on empirical observation had finally been decoded, its secrets revealed through the systematic application of scientific method. But that understanding didn't make it any less dangerous. If anything, the availability of pure atropine made it easier to achieve fatal doses, both through accident and through malicious intent. The scientific revolution had turned the deadly nightshade into a precisely calibrated pharmaceutical, but it was still deadly. Victorian era, patent medicines, and respectability. The 19th century saw the flowering of what we might call the Great Age of patent medicines, an era when virtually anyone could manufacture and sell medical preparations containing any substances they wished, making any claims they liked, with almost no regulation or oversight. This wild west of pharmaceuticals created enormous fortunes, ruined countless lives, and produced an extraordinary catalog of both genuine medicines and outrageous quackery. And BELLaDONNa alkaloids were absolutely central to this world, appearing in dozens, if not hundreds, of different commercial preparations sold to treat every ailment imaginable. The term patent medicine is actually a bit misleading. Most of these preparations were not actually patented, because patenting would have required revealing the secret formula, which would allow competitors to copy it. Instead, they were trademarked, meaning the name was legally protected, but the formula remained secret. This secrecy was central to their marketing appeal. The medicines were presented as having special, proprietary combinations of ingredients, the result of unique expertise or ancient wisdom, available only from one particular manufacturer. The marketing of patent medicines in this era was sophisticated and aggressive, taking advantage of the era's expanding print media and advertising industry. Advertisements filled the back pages of newspapers and magazines, featuring testimonials from supposedly satisfied customers, bold promises of cures, and warnings about the dangers of going untreated. The language was often pseudoscientific, using technical terms and invoking medical authority, without actually making specific falsifiable claims that could be easily challenged. For people living in the Victorian era, particularly in rural areas far from trained physicians, patent medicines filled a genuine need. Consulting a doctor was expensive. Many people couldn't afford it, and couldn't afford to take time off work to travel to where doctors were located. Patent medicines were available at the local store or through mail order. They were relatively cheap, and they came with promises of relief from whatever was troubling you. In a time when effective medical treatments were limited and most visits to a doctor would result in bloodletting, purging, or other interventions that were as likely to harm as help, patent medicines must have seemed like a reasonable option. The problem was that many people didn't understand what they were taking or what the risks were. Labels were often incomplete or misleading. Doses were poorly standardized. Instructions were vague. And many of the medicines were genuinely addictive, containing substantial amounts of opium, morphine, cocaine, or alcohol. People would start taking a medicine for a legitimate complaint, find that it made them feel better, continue taking it, and gradually become dependent on it without understanding what was happening. Victorian Britain and America had a serious addiction problem, but it was largely hidden, largely middle class and respectable, largely focused on substances that were legally available and socially acceptable. This situation created an interesting phenomenon where BELLaDONNa-containing medicines were associated simultaneously with respectability and with danger. On one hand, you could buy them at respectable pharmacies. They were advertised in respectable newspapers. They were used by respectable middle-class families. On the other hand, the knowledge that these medicines contained poisons, that they could cause dangerous reactions, that they needed to be used carefully, gave them a slightly transgressive quality. There was a thrill, a sense of taking something powerful and exotic, even as you bought it from the neighborhood druggist and took it in your parlor. Victorian women in particular seem to have used medicines containing BELLaDONNa alkaloids in large quantities. This was partly because many of these medicines were marketed specifically to women for female complaints, a broad and vague category that could mean anything from menstrual cramps to anxiety to vague malaise. It was also partly because the social restrictions on Victorian women's lives, the limited opportunities for meaningful work or self-expression, the expectations of endless emotional labor and domestic management created a kind of chronic low-level distress for which medicines promising relief were appealing. And it was partly because taking medicine, being slightly unwell, having nerves or delicate health, was socially acceptable for women in a way that other forms of acting out or expressing discontent were not. The phrase patent medicine addiction became increasingly common in late Victorian medical literature as physicians began to recognize the scope of the problem. But there was considerable victim blaming in how this was discussed. Addicted patients, especially women, were often characterized as morally weak, as self-indulgent, as bringing their problems on themselves through lack of self-control. The role of misleading advertising, of inadequate labeling, of physicians who themselves often prescribe these medicines liberally without fully understanding their addictive potential, was downplayed. The situation began to change in the early 20th century with the passage of the first drug regulation laws. In the United States, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required that labels accurately state the contents of medicines, particularly with regard to addictive substances like alcohol, opium, cocaine, and cannabis. While this act didn't ban any substances, it did require truth in labeling, which meant that consumers could at least know what they were taking. The effect on patent medicine sales was immediate and dramatic. When people could see exactly what was in their favorite remedies, many chose to stop using them. Sales of opium-containing patent medicines reportedly dropped by 33% almost overnight after the labeling requirements took effect. Belladonna alkaloids were not specifically targeted by the 1906 Act, partly because they were less obviously addictive than opium or cocaine, partly because they had legitimate medical uses that were well established. But the overall climate of increasing regulation and scrutiny affected their use in patent medicines. Manufacturers became more cautious about the claims they made and the doses they included. The era of anything-goes patent medicine marketing was coming to an end, replaced by an era of increasing, though still imperfect, regulatory oversight. By the 1920s and 30s, patent medicines as they had existed in the Victorian era were largely gone, replaced by proprietary medicines from established pharmaceutical companies that were at least somewhat more carefully formulated and honestly labeled. Belladonna remained an ingredient in many over-the-counter preparations, particularly for digestive complaints and motion sickness. But the wild, unregulated days of the Victorian patent medicine industry were over. The Victorian era had been belladonna's last hurrah as a mass-market consumer product, and, as that era ended, the plant retreated somewhat from popular consciousness, becoming once again primarily a prescription pharmaceutical and a subject for specialized medical use rather than a household remedy. Belladonna appeared in patent medicines in several forms. Sometimes it was listed on the label as an ingredient, sometimes under its chemical name atropine, sometimes as extract of belladonna, sometimes simply as anticholinergic agent, or hidden under vague terms like botanical extracts. Many patent medicines contain multiple active ingredients. Belladonna for its antispasmodic and sedating properties, opium or morphine for pain relief, alcohol for preservation and for its own intoxicating effects, cocaine for energy and mood elevation, cannabis for sedation, and various other substances depending on what the medicine was supposed to treat. One of the most famous patent medicines containing belladonna was a preparation called ABC liniment, where the letters stood for aconite, belladonna, and chloroform. This was marketed as a pain reliever and anti-inflammatory to be rubbed on the skin over painful areas. The combination was actually quite dangerous. Aconite is a cardiac poison that can cause fatal arrhythmias. Belladonna provided the anticholinergic effects. Chloroform was both a solvent and an anesthetic. All three could be absorbed through the skin, and the combination of cardiac and neurological toxins made overdoses distinctly possible. There are documented cases of people being poisoned by ABC liniment, including at least one death that was widely reported in newspapers of the time, leading eventually to its removal from the market. But ABC liniment was far from the only dangerous preparation available. Belladonna alkaloids appeared in cough syrups sold for children, in digestive aids, in women's tonics for menstrual complaints, in treatments for asthma and other respiratory conditions, in preparations for hemorrhoids, in remedies for seasickness and motion sickness. Some of these uses had genuine medical rationale based on belladonna's actual pharmacological effects. Others were purely speculative or based on outdated medical theories. And some were simply fraudulent, products that contained little or no active ingredient, but were sold based on outrageous claims and aggressive marketing. The Victorian era was also the heyday of belladonna plasters. These were cloth backing coated with a layer of material that contained belladonna alkaloids, meant to be stuck onto the skin over a painful area. The theory was that the alkaloid would be absorbed through the skin and provide localized pain relief. Whether these actually worked beyond a placebo effect is debatable, but they were enormously popular and widely used for conditions ranging from rheumatism to sciatica to tuberculosis. They were marketed as being particularly suitable for delicate individuals, meaning women and children who might not be able to tolerate internal medicines. The danger was that people would leave the plasters on too long or use too many at once and absorb toxic amounts of the drug through the skin. Modern medicine, from folk remedy to pharmaceutical. The 20th century transformed BELLaDONNa from a folk remedy and a patent medicine ingredient into a refined pharmaceutical tool with specific, carefully defined medical applications. This transformation was part of the larger movement in medicine toward evidence-based practice, standardized dosing, and the separation of legitimate medical treatment from quackery and folk tradition. But interestingly, despite the emergence of many new synthetic drugs, BELLaDONNa alkaloids never became obsolete. They remain in use today in several important clinical contexts, a testament to how fundamentally useful their pharmacological properties are. The most ubiquitous modern use of BELLaDONNa alkaloids is in ophthalmology. When you visit an eye doctor for a comprehensive eye exam, there's a good chance your pupils will be dilated using drops containing either atropine or a shorter-acting related compound like tropicamide. The ability to dilate pupils on command, to paralyze the focusing muscles of the eye, and allow clear visualization of the retina and optic nerve is essential for detecting conditions like retinal detachment, macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, glaucoma, and optic nerve damage. This use is so standard, so routine, that most people don't even think about the fact that they're being given a derivative of deadly nightshade. The pharmaceutical preparations used for this purpose are carefully standardized, with precisely measured concentrations and extensive safety testing. The doses are low enough that systemic side effects are minimal for most patients, though some people do experience increased heart rate, dry mouth, or blurred vision for several hours after the drops are applied. The irony that BELLaDONNa's cosmetic use in Renaissance Venice was blamed for causing blindness, while its modern medical use is essential for preventing blindness by allowing early detection of eye disease, is not lost on medical historians. Atropine also plays a crucial role in emergency cardiac care. One of its most important uses is in treating bradycardia, a condition where the heart beats too slowly, potentially leading to insufficient blood flow to the brain and other organs. Bradycardia can occur for many reasons: heart block, damage to the heart's electrical system, overdose of certain medications, or as a complication of a heart attack. When a patient's heart rate drops dangerously low, causing symptoms like dizziness, fainting, confusion, or cardiac arrest, atropine is often the first-line treatment. Administered intravenously, it quickly blocks the parasympathetic nervous system's brake on heart rate, allowing the heart to speed up. This can be immediately life-saving. Atropine is such a standard part of emergency medicine that it's kept in every hospital crash cart, every ambulance, every emergency department. Emergency medical personnel are trained to recognize situations where atropine is indicated and to administer quickly. The ability to rapidly reverse certain types of dangerous heart rhythms has saved countless lives, and it's all thanks to a chemical that came originally from a poisonous plant in European hedgerows. Another crucial modern use of atropine is as an antidote to certain types of poisoning, specifically poisoning by organophosphate pesticides or nerve agents. These compounds, which include common agricultural pesticides like malathion and military nerve agents like sarin and VX, work by inhibiting acetylcholinesterase, the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine in the synapse. When this enzyme is inhibited, acetylcholine accumulates, causing massive overstimulation of the cholinergic system. The symptoms are the opposite of atropine toxicity: excessive salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, muscle twitching, seizures, and potentially fatal respiratory failure. It's called cholinergic crisis, and it's absolutely terrifying. Atropine is the antidote. By flooding the system with a muscarinic receptor antagonist, you block the accumulated acetylcholine from having its effects. essentially fighting poison with poison. In cases of organophosphate poisoning, atropine is given in large and repeated doses, far higher than would normally be used for any other purpose, because the goal is to completely overcome the excess cholinergic activity. During World War II, when chemical warfare was a real threat, soldiers were issued auto-injectors containing atropine, along with other antidotes that they could use if exposed to nerve agents. Modern militaries still issue atropine as part of their chemical warfare defense kits. Scopolamine, the other major alkaloid from BELLaDONNa, has found its own niche in modern medicine, particularly in the treatment of motion sickness and nausea. Scopolamine is more sedating than atropine and crosses the blood-brain barrier more readily, making it more effective for conditions involving the central nervous system. It's available as a transdermal patch that can be worn behind the ear, slowly releasing the drug through the skin over several days. This is a remarkable bit of pharmaceutical engineering, taking a compound that in historical times was associated with witches and poisoners and turning it into a convenient, relatively safe treatment for the nausea that can plague travelers on ships, planes, or even in cars. BELLaDONNa alkaloids also appear in various prescription medications for gastrointestinal problems. The combination of BELLaDONNa alkaloids with phenobarbital, sold under the brand name Donatol and various generics, is used to treat irritable bowel syndrome, a common condition characterized by abdominal pain, cramping, bloating, and alternating diarrhea and constipation. The anticholinergic properties help reduce intestinal spasms and slow down an overactive digestive tract. While this medication is considered only possibly effective by FDA standards and has significant potential side effects, some patients find it helpful when other treatments have failed. There's also a BELLaDONNa and opium suppository, a combination that seems almost medieval in its composition, but which is actually still used in modern medicine for severe bladder spasms and urinary tract pain, particularly after certain types of surgery. The BELLaDONNa reduces bladder muscle spasm, while the opium provides pain relief. It's an elegant combination in its way, taking advantage of the complementary properties of two ancient plant medicines that humans have been using for millennia. The pharmaceutical industry has also developed synthetic compounds based on the atropine molecule, but modified to alter their properties, creating a whole class of anticholinergic drugs with various specialized uses. Some of these are used as bronchodilators for treating asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Some are used as antispasmodics for bladder control problems. Some are used in Parkinson's disease to reduce tremors and rigidity. The atropine molecule has been a template, a starting point for medicinal chemistry, leading to dozens of related drugs that retain some of its useful properties while minimizing side effects. However, modern medicine has also become increasingly aware of the risks of anticholinergic medications, particularly in older adults. The American Geriatric Society has identified anticholinergics as potentially inappropriate medications for elderly patients and recommends avoiding them when possible. This is because older adults are more sensitive to anticholinergic side effects, particularly cognitive impairment, confusion, and increased risk of falls. There's also emerging evidence that long-term use of anticholinergics might increase the risk of dementia, though the data is still being debated. As a result, modern prescribing practices emphasize using anticholinergics only when clearly necessary and at the lowest effective dose. The homeopathic industry has also laid claim to BELLaDONNa, with various homeopathic preparations containing extremely diluted forms of BELLaDONNa being sold for conditions like fever, headache, and teething pain in infants. The theory behind homeopathy is that substances that cause symptoms in healthy people can cure those same symptoms in sick people if given in highly diluted forms. This theory has no scientific basis, and randomized controlled trials have consistently failed to show that homeopathic preparations work better than placebo. The problem with homeopathic BELLaDONNa products is that homeopathic regulations are much looser than pharmaceutical regulations, and there have been several cases where homeopathic teething products were found to contain actually dangerous levels of BELLaDONNa alkaloids rather than the infinitesimal amounts that homeopathic theory calls for. The FDA has issued several warnings about homeopathic belladonna products, particularly those marketed for infants, after reports of serious adverse events including seizures, difficulty breathing, and deaths. This has created a strange situation where a remedy that's supposed to be so diluted as to be essentially just water turns out to occasionally contain enough of the actual poison to harm people. In modern herbal medicine, BELLaDONNa is generally recognized as too dangerous to use and is avoided by responsible practitioners. Unlike some other traditional medicinal plants that have made a comeback in the natural medicine movement, BELLaDONNa's reputation as genuinely deadly has kept it out of most herbal medicine cabinets. The exception is in some European countries where carefully standardized BELLaDONNa leaf preparations are still available by prescription from pharmacies, used by traditional herbalists for very specific indications under careful medical supervision. But even there, it's recognized as a powerful and dangerous plant that requires expert knowledge to use safely. The journey of BELLaDONNa, from folk medicine to modern pharmaceutical, illustrates a broader pattern in the history of medicine. Many of our most important drugs have come from plants that were used for centuries by traditional healers. But the transition from traditional use to modern pharmaceutical use required systematic scientific study, chemical standardization, carefully controlled clinical trials, and the development of regulatory frameworks to ensure safety and efficacy. This process strips away much of the mystique, much of the cultural richness of traditional medicine, but also strips away the danger and the guesswork. When you're given atropine by a paramedic during a medical emergency, you're benefiting from thousands of years of human experience with this plant, refined through decades of scientific research, and delivered through modern manufacturing processes that ensure that every dose contains exactly what it's supposed to contain and nothing more. Dark modern history and contemporary legacy. As we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, BELLaDONNa's story takes on new dimensions, shaped by modern science, global politics, and continued human fascination with its power to alter consciousness and end life. The plant that had served as medicine, poison, cosmetic, and sacrament for thousands of years found new and disturbing roles in the modern world, even as some of its traditional uses persisted in unexpected forms. One of the darkest chapters in BELLaDONNa's modern history involves its derivatives being studied as potential chemical weapons and so-called truth serums during the Cold War. The story is fragmentary, heavily classified in many cases, but enough has emerged through declassified documents and historical research to sketch the outlines. During World War II, atropine became strategically important as the antidote to nerve agents. The Germans had developed the first organophosphate nerve gases, including tobun and sarin, which threatened to revolutionize chemical warfare by being far more deadly than the chlorine and mustard gas of World War I. When intelligence agencies learned about these weapons, there was panic about how to protect soldiers who might be exposed. Atropine, already well understood for medical use, was the obvious solution. Military forces on both sides of the conflict began stockpiling atropine and developing rapid delivery systems, including auto-injectors that could be carried by individual soldiers and used immediately if they were exposed to nerve gas. After the war, during the early Cold War period, intelligence agencies in both the United States and Soviet Union became interested in drugs that might serve as truth serums or mind control agents. The logic was that if you could find a drug that would make someone unable to lie or unable to resist interrogation, you would have a powerful intelligence gathering tool. The CIA's MKUltra program, which ran from the 1950s through the early 1970s, tested dozens of drugs for this purpose, including LSD, barbiturates, amphetamines, and various other compounds. Scopolamine, the BELLaDONNa alkaloid that crosses into the brain most readily, was one of the substances tested. The theory was that because it caused confusion, memory impairment, and suggestibility, it might make interrogation subjects more pliable and unable to maintain cover stories. In reality, these experiments were a failure for their intended purpose. Scopolamine didn't make people tell the truth. It made them confused and hallucinate and say random things that couldn't be distinguished from true memories or complete fabrications. A person under the influence of high doses of scopolamine is not a reliable source of information. They're barely a coherent, conscious entity. But the research did produce some lasting effects. The experiments conducted as part of MKUltra and similar programs were frequently unethical, involving dosing unwitting subjects without consent, including psychiatric patients, prisoners, and sex workers. People were harmed, both during the experiments and by the lasting trauma of being subjected to such treatment. When details of these programs were revealed in the 1970s through congressional investigations, they became a significant scandal and led to new regulations about human research ethics and oversight. There's also a persistent rumor, difficult to verify, about scopolamine being used as a criminal tool, particularly in Colombia and other parts of South America. The claim is that criminals administer scopolamine to victims, often by blowing powder in their faces or slipping it into their drinks, making them highly suggestible and compliant. The drug victims then supposedly accompany the criminals willingly to ATMs to withdraw money, to their homes to hand over valuables, or even assist the criminals in robbing their own homes, all while in a dissociative state. Afterward, they have little or no memory of what happened. How much of this is real versus urban legend is hard to determine. There are certainly documented cases of people being drugged and robbed in ways that match these descriptions, and scopolamine has been detected in some cases. The symptoms described, complete amnesia combined with superficial consciousness and suggestibility, are consistent with high-dose scopolamine effects. But the prevalence of this crime has probably been exaggerated by sensational media reporting and by the fact that it makes for a compelling and frightening story. The name given to this alleged crime tool, devil's breath, plays into existing cultural associations between BELLaDONNa and evil. In legitimate clinical contexts, there was a period in the mid-20th century when scopolamine was used in obstetrics as part of something called twilight sleep, a technique for managing the pain of childbirth. Women would be given a combination of morphine and scopolamine that would put them into a state where they remained conscious and could follow instructions, but experience pain relief and later had no memory of the labor. This was marketed as a humane alternative to the suffering of natural childbirth, and many women advocated for access to twilight sleep. However, the reality was more complicated and disturbing. Women in twilight sleep often thrashed around violently, requiring physical restraints. They would scream and cry out, but later not remember doing so. The scopolamine-induced amnesia meant they had no conscious memory of the birth of their own children, which many women later found deeply troubling. And because they couldn't remember the experience, they couldn't report on whether the obstetric staff had treated them respectfully or not, which created opportunities for abuse. By the 1960s and 70s, as the women's health movement gained strength and as better pain management options became available, twilight sleep fell out of favor and is no longer used. In contemporary times, BELLaDONNa continues to appear periodically in poisoning cases, usually accidental. Children are attracted to the sweet-tasting berries and eat them, not knowing the danger. Amateur herbalists or foragers confuse deadly nightshade with edible plants like blueberries. People experimenting with psychoactive plants underestimate the dose needed to cause hallucinations, which is dangerously close to the dose that causes toxicity and death. There are even cases of people intentionally poisoning others, though these are rare. Modern medical response to BELLaDONNa poisoning is supportive. There's no specific antidote that can rapidly remove the alkaloids from the body, though physostigmine can help reverse some of the more dangerous effects by inhibiting the breakdown of acetylcholine, effectively increasing the amount of acetylcholine available to compete with the atropine or scopolamine for receptor binding. Beyond that, treatment involves managing symptoms, cooling the patient if their temperature is dangerously high, giving benzodiazepines for seizures, monitoring heart rhythm, providing mechanical ventilation if respiratory depression occurs. Most people who receive prompt medical care for BELLaDONNa poisoning survive, though they may have an extremely unpleasant several days while the drug clears their system. The contemporary legal status of belladonna varies by jurisdiction. The plant itself is not generally illegal to grow. It's sold by nurseries as an ornamental plant, though usually with prominent warnings about its toxicity. The pure alkaloids, atropine and scopolamine, are prescription medications, and their unauthorized possession or distribution is illegal. In the United States, belladonna is regulated as a dangerous drug under Food and Drug Law, meaning that products containing belladonna alkaloids must meet pharmaceutical standards if they're being sold for medical purposes. The cultural legacy of belladonna remains strong in literature, film, and popular culture. It appears in murder mysteries and thrillers as a poison tool. It shows up in historical dramas set in periods when its use was more common. It's a staple of witch-themed stories and Halloween imagery. The name alone, Deadly Nightshade, carries a gothic weight that makes it irresistible for certain kinds of storytelling. Even people who know nothing else about botany or pharmacology often know that deadly nightshade exists and that it's dangerous. What's interesting is how the various strands of belladonna's history, the medical and the mystical, the cosmetic and the criminal, the scientific and the folkloric, all continue to coexist in the cultural imagination. We can walk into a pharmacy and buy medication containing belladonna derivatives for motion sickness, while simultaneously understanding belladonna as a symbol of hidden danger, of forbidden knowledge, of the boundary between healing and harming. This duality, this persistent ambiguity about whether belladonna represents medicine or poison, science or magic, help or harm, seems to be central to its enduring fascination. It's a liminal substance, existing at boundaries and transitions. It can cure or kill depending on the dose, the preparation, the intent of the person using it. It can expand consciousness or destroy it. It can make you beautiful or blind you. It can save your life in a medical emergency or end it if carelessly used. This threshold nature, this power to transform in multiple directions, has always been what makes belladonna so compelling and so dangerous. As we conclude this long history, we're left with some unsettling questions. What does it mean that humans have been willing, throughout all of recorded history, and likely before, to use substances that they know can kill them? What does it tell us about the pursuit of beauty that women were willing to risk blindness for larger pupils? What does it tell us about the history of medicine that physicians used deadly poisons as their primary therapeutic tools for thousands of years? What does it tell us about power and control that knowledge of plants like belladonna has been so carefully guarded, so feared by authorities, so associated with transgression and rebellion? Perhaps what the history of belladonna ultimately reveals is how fine the line is between poison and cure, between control and chaos, between the desire to alleviate suffering and the temptation to manipulate and harm. Every tool can be used for good or ill. Every source of power can be turned to destruction. Every medicine can become a poison if misused. And knowledge itself, the understanding of how nature works and how it can be manipulated, is always a double-edged gift. The beautiful lady of the deadly nightshade, a trope of belladonna, stands as a testament to humanity's complex relationship with the natural world, to our ability to find both healing and harm in the same source, to our willingness to take enormous risks in pursuit of relief from pain, enhancement of beauty, or alteration of consciousness. It reminds us that nature is neither benevolent nor malevolent, but simply is, and that it is our choices, our knowledge, our wisdom or lack thereof, that determines whether the plants we encounter become sources of life or instruments of death. So remember this. The next time you sit in an ophthalmologist's chair and feel those stinging drops that dilate your pupils, you are participating in a history that stretches back to Renaissance courtesans and ancient goddesses, to medieval herbalists and Enlightenment chemists, to Victorian ladies and Cold War interrogators. You are touching, however safely and clinically, something that carries within it millennia of human experience, both glorious and terrible. The deadly beauty of belladonna is not just botanical, it is human. It is the story of what we are capable of, for better and for worse, when we reach for power over life and death, over consciousness and beauty, over suffering and healing. And with that, our long journey through the history of BELLaDONNa comes to an end. If you've made it this far, if you've stayed with me through 3 hours of stories about poisons and beauty and medicine and murder, then I thank you for your time and attention. If you found this valuable, if you learned something or saw history in a new light, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. These deep dives take enormous research and time to create, and your support makes it possible to continue exploring these fascinating, disturbing, enlightening corners of human history. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your dreams untainted by deadly nightshade, and your pursuit of knowledge always tempered with wisdom about the powers you seek to understand.